Welcome to our deep dive. We're taking a look at the future of forest science. And we've got some incredible source material. Chapter 11, right?
Yes, Chapter 11. It lays out some really fascinating future directions for the field.
Like I was just skimming it before we started. And wow, there's a lot to unpack here. We've got stuff on new technology, then a whole section on like a more holistic approach, and even what's happening globally. Plus, training the next generation of ecologists.
It is. It's a really exciting time to be involved in forest science.
For sure. Okay, let's dive right in. This section on technological advances, I mean, wow. It's mind-blowing. Like, forget climbing trees with measuring tapes and notebooks. We're talking satellites and lasers and even AI now.
Yeah, it's incredible how technology is completely transforming the way we study forests.
So, like, give me an example. What do we talk about specifically?
Well, for instance, we have satellites like Landsat and Sentinel. They're providing these high-resolution images, right?
Okay.
And those images allow us to track forest cover, deforestation, and even see how climate change is impacting things, but on a global scale.
That's wild. So we can monitor the health of entire forests from space.
Pretty much, yeah. It's really remarkable.
Okay, but what about getting like a more detailed view? Zooming in, you know?
Right, well, that's where drones come in. And they're equipped with LiDAR technology.
The LiDAR. Okay, so what's that?
So LiDAR allows us to create these incredibly detailed 3D models of the forest canopy. We can measure tree height, density, even identify individual species.
No way. So it's like having a super-powered magnifying glass for the forest.
Exactly.
But all of that data, I mean, that must be a lot to process.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where AI and machine learning come in.
Okay, I was going to ask about that. So AI is actually being used in forest science.
Oh, yeah, big time. These tools can sift through massive amounts of data, from satellites, drones, everything. They can identify patterns, predict how forests might change.
So almost like like a team of super smart forest detectives.
Yeah, something like that. Working around the clock.
That's incredible. Okay, so this all sounds really high tech. But what about the human element?
That's a great question. And it leads us to another really important shift in forest science. We need to have a more, interdisciplinary approach. And a big part of that is systems thinking. We're realizing that you can't study forests in isolation.
Right, they're part of a larger system.
Exactly. We need to consider all these factors: social, economic, cultural.
Yeah, because those things impact how forests are managed and how they impact people's lives too.
Right. We need to bring everyone together: ecologists, social scientists, economists, policymakers, everyone, to see that bigger picture.
So it's about seeing the forest for the trees, literally.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's where systems thinking comes in. It's about recognizing that everything in a forest is connected. Change one thing and it can have ripple effects, stuff we might not expect.
Okay, I get the concept. But could you give me a real-world example?
Sure. Let's look at the Ojibwe people. They have these sustainable wild rice harvesting practices in the Great Lakes region.
I've heard about that, yeah.
They've figured out how to harvest this precious food source for generations. And they do it without harming the ecosystem. That's systems thinking in action. They understand the wild rice, the water levels it needs, and leaving enough to regrow.
Wow. So they're not just thinking about the rice itself.
Right. They understand all those interconnected elements of the ecosystem.
That's remarkable. It's like they've been living in harmony with nature for so long, you know?
They have. And it makes their traditional ecological knowledge incredibly valuable, especially now.
Their tech, right.
Yeah. And what's exciting is that scientists and conservationists are actually collaborating more and more with indigenous communities to integrate that tech into modern practices.
So it's blending ancient wisdom with cutting-edge science.
Exactly. And it's leading to some really promising approaches to forest conservation.
I love that. Okay, so we've talked about the tech, the need for a broader approach, but what about the bigger picture? How are these efforts being coordinated on a larger scale?
Well, that's the good news. There's this growing awareness about the importance of forests, but on a global level. And we're seeing this in international agreements and initiatives. They're aimed at protecting and managing forests, but more sustainably.
So it's not just local efforts anymore. There's a global movement taking shape.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so what are some examples of these initiatives?
Well, the Paris Agreement is a big one.
Right. That was adopted by, nearly 200 countries?
Yeah, it's huge. And it recognizes the role of forests in climate change, for sure.
Okay, but how do we translate those commitments into action?
Right. Well, that's where things like the REDD Plus program come in.
REDD Plus. Ooh, What's that stand for?
Reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation.
Oh, okay, got it.
And it provides financial incentives to developing countries to reduce deforestation and promote those sustainable practices.
So it's about making forest conservation, what, economically viable.
Exactly. It's a market-based approach. Countries can earn carbon credits for reducing deforestation and then sell those credits to developed countries that want to offset their emissions.
Oh, interesting. So it's a win-win, potentially, for the environment and the people who rely on forests for their livelihoods.
That's the goal, yes.
Okay. But I imagine something like that on a global scale must come with challenges.
Oh, absolutely. One big concern is making sure these market mechanisms actually benefit local communities and don't end up harming them.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We also have to be really vigilant about monitoring and verifying that projects are actually reducing emissions and not just shifting deforestation somewhere else.
Right, because that wouldn't really solve the problem.
Exactly. It's complex, for sure, but it's a big step forward in terms of recognizing the value of forests and creating financial incentives to protect them, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, this is all incredibly informative, but I have one last question. We've talked about the tech, the holistic approach, the global initiatives, but who's going to be leading this charge to protect these ecosystems in the future?
That's a crucial question, and it brings us to the topic of educating the next generation of ecologists.
Right. We need to make sure they're prepared for this.
Yes, absolutely. We need to make sure they're equipped to tackle these challenges.
So how do we prepare these future forest guardians? What kind of education will they need?
Well, it's becoming pretty clear that the traditional way of teaching ecology, just focusing on biology, isn't enough anymore.
Okay, so what does that mean? What should it look like?
Well, we need to be more interdisciplinary. Future ecologists need a broader understanding, spanning multiple fields.
More than just biology, then?
Right. They need to connect ecology with economics, social justice, even policy.
Wow. So they almost need to be like eco-diplomats.
Huh, I like that. Able to navigate all these complexities in a world that's changing really fast.
Right. It's a tall order.
It is. And it's not just scientific knowledge either. They need to be great communicators, too, because they'll need to translate all these complex ideas into something everyone can understand.
For sure. To get everyone on board. Okay, so how do we teach systems thinking? Is that something you can learn from a textbook?
It's more of a mindset, I think. A way of approaching problems. It requires hands-on experience, working in the field, collaborating with all kinds of people.
So learning by doing, essentially.
Exactly. Field work, internships, community-based projects, international collaborations, all of that is essential.
It's about fostering that critical thinking, right, and being adaptable.
Exactly, because the only constant is change, especially with climate change.
Okay, so this has been a fascinating overview of the future of forest science. We've covered a lot of ground. Technology, the need for this broader approach, global initiatives. But I want to learn more about this interconnectedness. Can we dig into that a little more?
Absolutely. So one of the most fascinating discoveries lately has been this realization that trees, well, they aren't these solitary individuals. They're actually interconnected.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Through these underground networks of fungi, it's often called the Wood Wide Web.
The Wood Wide Web. Okay, hold on. So we're talking about actual physical connections between trees, like underground cables.
Not cables exactly, but networks of these fungal filaments. They're called mycorrhiza.
Okay. And what do these mycorrhizae do?
They form these symbiotic relationships with tree roots. They extend their reach way beyond the tree's own root system.
So it really is like a giant underground social network for trees.
You got it. And through those networks, trees can share nutrients, water, even chemical signals.
Wow. This is where it gets really interesting. Tell me more about these exchanges. What kind of information are trees sharing?
Well, for one thing, nutrients. Trees need things like nitrogen and phosphorus to grow, and those nutrients can be transported through the mycorrhizal network from areas where there is a lot to areas where there's not enough.
So trees can actually help each other out, like sharing food.
Yes, it's amazing, and especially helpful for young seedlings. They might struggle to get everything they need.
Right, because they're so small.
Exactly. Mature trees, what we call mother trees, can use the network to give seedlings a boost.
Mother trees. I love that. So they're like nurturing the younger trees.
Yeah, exactly. They increase those seedlings' chances of survival. And there's even evidence that mother trees can prioritize where the nutrients go, like to their own offspring.
No way. That's incredible. So it's not just about nutrients though, right?
Right. Trees can use chemical signals too to communicate, like When a tree is attacked by pests or a disease, it can release chemicals into the network to alert nearby trees.
So it's like a forest-wide alarm system.
Yeah. And those warnings give other trees time to activate their defenses, make them less susceptible.
That's wild. So they can communicate about danger. What other messages are they sending?
Well, they can also coordinate their growth and development, like signaling when it's time to start producing leaves in the spring or shedding them in the fall.
It's like they're all syncing their calendars, making sure they're on the same page.
Ah, that's a great way to put it. It's incredible how complex their communication system is.
It really is. So this Wood Wide Web idea, it really changes the way we think about forests, doesn't it? It's not just a bunch of individual trees competing.
You're right. It's a more holistic understanding. They're complex, cooperative systems.
This is revolutionary. But what does it mean for how we manage forests? How can we use this knowledge?
That's a great question, and it's something scientists are actively exploring. This discovery has big implications for forest management.
So how do we protect this Wood Wide Web then? Make sure it stays healthy.
Well, one thing is recognizing that disrupting the mycorrhizal network can be really bad for the forest. Like practices like clear cutting that remove a ton of trees that can sever those connections.
Right, because it's all connected.
Exactly. And then it's harder for the forest to recover. We need to be more careful about how we harvest trees, move towards more sustainable forestry practices, practices that keep that network intact.
Okay, so what would that look like? Give me an example.
Well, selective logging, for instance, where you only remove certain trees, that can be less disruptive than just clear cutting everything.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
We can also focus on promoting a wider variety of trees because different trees have relationships with different types of fungi.
Right. So it's about diversity.
Yeah. It makes the network stronger, more resilient.
Okay, so are there other things we need to be thinking about?
We also need to think about the role of those mother trees. Protecting them is crucial. They're like hubs in the network.
Right, giving that support to the seedling.
Exactly. It's all about understanding and protecting the entire system.
Not just focusing on individual trees. Got it. Wow, this is incredible. It's like we're just scratching the surface of this Wood Wide Web and how it can help us.
We are. There's so much more to learn. But the research is expanding rapidly, and the more we know, the better we can manage forests for both people and the environment.
This has been an amazing journey beneath the surface. Literally, the Wood Wide Web really is a marvel of nature.
Yeah.
And it's amazing to think we're only just beginning to understand it.
I know. It really is incredible. And this is just one example of the exciting discoveries happening in forest science. As we keep exploring, we're gaining this deeper appreciation for how resilient forests are, how beautiful they are, and how important they are for life on Earth. Welcome back to our deep dive. We're picking up where we left off, talking about the Wood Wide Web, how trees are all connected. It's pretty amazing stuff.
It really is. And in part one, you mentioned how this discovery is changing how we think about forest management, like how we can actually work with these systems. I'm really curious to hear more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest things is how we approach forest regeneration. We can't just focus on planting new trees. We need to support the existing mycorrhizal connections, that network.
So it's not just about the quantity of trees we plant, but also how we plant them and the health of the soil.
Exactly. And that's where mother trees come in. Remember, we talked about how they're like hubs in that network. They're vital for those young seedlings.
Right. So protecting those mother trees is key for successful forest regeneration. What are some strategies for doing that?
Well, we can change how we do logging. Like instead of clear cutting where you remove all the trees in an area, we can try selective logging, leave some of those mother trees standing.
So being more strategic about which trees we harvest. Okay, so that's one thing. What else?
Another approach is using soil from mature forests. Soil that's already rich in those mycorrhizal fungi.
Oh, interesting. So you're basically transplanting the Wood Wide Web to a new area.
Yeah, kind of. It's a pretty new technique, but the early results look good. And this brings us to another way we can use this knowledge, making forests more resilient to climate change.
That's a big one for sure. Everyone's talking about climate change these days. How can the Wood Wide Web help with that?
Well, think about it. Climate change is putting a lot of stress on forests. Higher temperatures, droughts, wildfires. It's tough. But the mycorrhizal network can actually help trees deal with those challenges.
Really? How so?
For example, during a drought, trees connected to the network can access water from deeper in the soil, water they couldn't reach on their own. And they can even share water with each other.
So the network is like a safety net during a drought. Amazing.
Yeah. And there's also evidence that the fungi can help trees fight off diseases and pests. Some fungi produce compounds that are like, natural antibiotics, and they can boost the tree's own immune system.
So the network isn't just about sharing resources, it's about keeping the trees healthy overall.
Exactly. And this has big implications for how we manage forests, especially with climate change. By making sure that network is healthy and diverse, we can help forests cope with these challenges.
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we support that diversity? Any practical tips?
Well, one thing is to avoid practices that disrupt the soil. Things like tilling or compaction that can damage those delicate fungal threads.
Right, so we need to be gentle with the soil.
Yes. We can also encourage a greater variety of tree species because different trees connect with different fungi. More diversity makes the network more resilient.
It's like what? Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. And we also need to be mindful of other human activities that might affect the network, like using certain pesticides or fertilizers. Those can harm the fungi.
So it's about understanding the bigger picture, how everything is connected.
Yes. And I think we're just starting to understand how this wood wide web can change forest management. There's still so much we don't know, but the research is really taking off.
I'm excited to see what they discover. This has been fascinating, but I have another question. We're talking about trees communicating and cooperating. Does that change how we should view them? Ethically, I mean.
That's a really important point. It definitely challenges that old view of trees just being, well, passive objects. If they can form these social relationships, does that mean we have a greater responsibility towards them?
It makes you think. So how do we navigate these ethical questions? It seems complicated.
I think it starts with recognizing that forests have value in and of themselves. It's not just about how useful they are to us. We need a more holistic view.
So respecting their right to exist just because they're there.
Exactly. And that should change how we manage them. It's not just about extracting resources. It's about ensuring their long-term health and well-being, including that amazing social network they have.
It's a big shift in thinking, for sure. But it sounds like it's essential if we want to protect forests for the future.
I agree. We need more sustainable forestry practices that focus on the entire ecosystem, not just short-term profits.
Well said. This conversation about the wood wide web has really been eye-opening. It makes you realize how interconnected everything is.
Yeah.
And how much we still have to learn.
It really does. And the more we learn about the wood wide web, the more we realize how we need to change our relationship with forests.
For sure. It's not just about the trees, it's about the entire system.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered some really fascinating ground in the first two parts of our deep dive. We talked about the wood wide web, how trees are all interconnected, and how that's changing the way we think about forests. But now I'm curious about the bigger picture, the global scale. What's happening on that front?
Well, it's encouraging to see that there's this growing recognition of how important forests are. But on a global level, people are realizing that forests aren't just about timber anymore.
Right. They're crucial for climate change, biodiversity, even for the livelihoods of millions of people.
Exactly. And that's led to more international agreements and initiatives to protect and manage them more sustainably.
Can you give me some examples of what's happening globally?
Sure. Well, we talked about the Paris Agreement before. A big part of that is acknowledging the role of forests in climate change.
Right. Countries are starting to get it. That protecting forests is key to meeting those climate goals. But how do we make sure they actually follow through on those commitments?
That's the challenge, isn't it? And that's where things like the RVDD Plus program come into play.
RVDP Plus Drive, right. That's all about making forest conservation pay off, right?
Yeah.
Economically, I mean.
Yeah, exactly. The idea is to create financial incentives for developing countries, so they'll reduce deforestation and use more sustainable practices.
Okay, so remind me how that works again.
It's a market-based approach. Basically, countries that reduce deforestation can earn these carbon credits, and then they can sell those credits to developed countries that, well, need to offset their own emissions.
This is like a global carbon market, but for forests. That sounds interesting, but are there any downsides? I mean, it seems like it could be complicated.
It is complicated. There are some concerns, definitely. Like, how do we make sure these projects are actually leading to real emissions reductions and not just shifting deforestation somewhere else?
Yeah, that makes sense. You don't want to just move the problem around.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of making sure the benefits are going to the right people. The local communities who rely on those forests, we need to make sure they're not being exploited.
Right. You don't want corporations or governments swooping in and taking advantage.
Exactly. So there needs to be a lot of transparency and accountability built in. There's definitely debate about how effective and fair these market-based approaches really are. But it is a step in the right direction. It shows that we're starting to recognize the global value of forests and that we need to find ways to protect them.
Okay, that makes sense. It sounds like finding that right balance is really important. But what about the role of indigenous communities in all of this? We talked before about how valuable their traditional knowledge is. Is that being incorporated into these global initiatives?
Yes, and that's really encouraging to see. There's a growing movement to include traditional knowledge in how we manage and conserve forests. Indigenous communities have been taking care of forests for centuries. They have this incredible depth of knowledge about how to do it sustainably.
Right, they've been doing it for generations, and now that wisdom is being recognized more widely.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Yeah.
the Convention on Biological Diversity, that emphasizes respecting and integrating traditional knowledge. And we're seeing more collaboration too. Scientists and policymakers working directly with indigenous communities to come up with plans that combine scientific knowledge with those traditional practices.
That sounds like a really powerful partnership, like the best of both worlds.
It has a lot of potential. It's about recognizing that there are different ways of knowing and understanding forests, and that by combining those different perspectives, we can come up with more holistic solutions.
I love that. Okay, so we've talked about the global efforts, but I keep coming back to this question of who's going to be leading the charge in the future, the next generation of ecologists. What are we doing to prepare them for this?
It's such an important question. We need to make sure they have the tools and the passion to deal with the challenges facing forests. And those challenges are just going to get more complex.
So it's not enough to just pass on the knowledge we have now.
Yeah,
They need to be ready for a future that's constantly changing.
exactly. The world's changing faster than ever, and that means we need a new kind of ecologist, someone who's not only good at science, but who can also adapt and think outside the box.
And we talked before about how important systems thinking is.
Right. They need to be able to see those connections, how forests are linked to social, economic, and political systems. They need to work across different fields, collaborate with all kinds of experts to find solutions that work for everyone.
So it's not just about studying trees, it's about understanding these complex systems
Yeah.
and how they all fit together.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just the technical skills, too. We need to instill a love of nature in these future ecologists, a real passion for protecting forests. It needs to be more than just a job.
It's about making it a calling, right? A lifelong commitment.
Yes, exactly. We need to inspire them to become guardians of the forest, people who are dedicated to protecting these ecosystems for the long term.
And how do we do that? How do we foster that passion and give them the skills they need?
Well, education is key, of course, but we need to rethink how we're teaching ecology. It can't just be about biology anymore. We need to bring in other disciplines like social science, economics, even ethics.
So it's about creating a more well-rounded approach to learning about forests.
Exactly. And it's not just what we teach, but how we teach it. We need to move away from the traditional classroom setting and give students more hands-on experience.
Get them out in the field, working directly with the ecosystems they're studying.
Exactly. Fieldwork, internships, community projects, international collaborations, all of that is so important for developing those critical thinking skills and that deep connection with nature.
It's about learning by doing, experiencing the complexities of forests firsthand. And that brings us full circle, doesn't it? From the technology we're using to study forests to the global efforts to protect them, the future of forest science is incredibly dynamic. There's so much potential.
There is. And what's most exciting is this growing awareness that we need to shift our perspective. We need to move away from this human-centered view of forests and see them for what they really are. These incredible interconnected systems that are essential for all life on Earth.
This deep dive has been truly inspiring. It's given me so much hope for the future of forests. Even with the challenges we're facing, like climate change and deforestation, there are so many people who are dedicated to protecting them, and that's a powerful thing.
I agree. And with a new generation of passionate, skilled ecologists coming up, I think we can create a future where forests continue to thrive.
That's a beautiful thought. Thank you so much for guiding us through this exploration of forest science. I hope our listeners have learned as much as I have, and that they're leaving with a renewed sense of wonder about the incredible world of forests.
It's been my pleasure, and I hope everyone will continue to be inspired by the resilience and the wisdom of forests.